Good evening and good morning and good afternoon to all the Christians and the Jews and the atheists and the Muslims and the agnostics and the Hindus and the Buddhists from all around the world who are tuning in right now. I hear some sound effects from your text, which means I haven't turned off the sound effects. All right, problem solved. I'm here with good friend Robert Spencer, who is one of the only people on the planet who still talks about Islam and makes perfect sense. So Robert is the author of about 487 books on Islam, the most significant being his recent masterpiece, The History of Jihad. Robert, while all of my friends here and I are clicking that like button, and then we go out and share with all our friends that we are live on, that we're live here discussing the history of jihad. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do at Jihad Watch?
Thanks, David, and peace be upon those who are rightly guided. I am the director of Jihad Watch. For 15 years, every day of my life, I have chronicled jihad activity, violent and stealthy, in the United States and around the world, in all its forms and manifestations, as many news stories as I can find. I also provide a general explanation on each one, some brief commentary, sometimes lengthy commentary, explaining why this really is jihad, despite the establishment media obfuscation and attempts to cover up that fact. And so jihadwatch.org is your one-stop resource for news about this ongoing threat and little understood phenomenon. And then, yes, I also have the books which deal with the Quran, with Mohammed, and most recently with the history of jihad.
Now, Robert, I'm a little confused because you seem to think that jihad is actually a problem and not something that's great for humanity. And the reason I find this confusing brings us to the topic that we're going to be addressing right now. Mohammed Hijab. We share lots of information, but we come up with new opportunities to share information that we've shared before in different contexts. But Mohammed Hijab, in a recent debate, during the Q&A, there was no opportunity to respond to something that someone else said in the Q&A. So Mohammed Hijab was asked, how do you account for the spread of Christianity by the power of the Holy Spirit, not through the sword? Whereas Islam was spread by the sword. And Mohammed Hijab responded by insisting that Christianity only ever spread through the sword, whereas Islam spread organically. And Islam only fought people who basically deserved it because of the things that they were doing. So I have never tried to play a video clip live. I do want to try that right now just so people can see what we're talking about. And let's go ahead and see what Mohammed Hijab claims.
Point 2 about Christianity not being spread by the sword is a misreading of history. Actually, if you look at Constantine and the Theodosian Code, actually the only way Christianity spread through the Roman Empire was through the sword. Look at the primary source material about the Theodosian Code. From Theodosius II, he enforced Nicene Trinitarianism by force, according to all of the historians, across the whole of the Roman Empire until the pagan religions of the Romans were completely dissipated. Not to mention, of course, colonialism. Not to mention, of course, the Spanish colonists. Not to mention, of course, one of the biggest casualties in war in human history, yes, one of the biggest, was when the Spanish Empire and the French Empire and the British Empire spread it to your country in Africa. It spread it everywhere. Don't tell me it wasn't spread by the sword. Don't tell me it wasn't spread by the sword. What are you talking about? The difference between Islam and Christianity in this regard was that Islam spread organically, whereas Christianity required a man who was an empire at that time to spread it forcefully. We fought, as Muslims, the bigger enemy. You were the bigger enemy, fighting the smaller people. That's the difference. Don't tell me about these things. Don't misread history.
All right. Now, that should be somewhat frightening because he's saying you guys, you are the bigger enemy. So Muslims fight Christians because Christians are the bigger enemy historically. And he certainly would views me as an enemy and you as well, Robert. Now, that was those were some interesting claims there. First, I mean, we can kind of break them down. So the main claim in the first part was that Christianity only spread through violence. Those were his words. Christianity only spread through violence, whereas Islam spread organically, and again, only fought because, there were certain people who were bullying people and Islam had to stand up for these poor people. Suppose we grant, and we would have to grant, there was violence in Christianity. What's interesting is, in Christianity, we discuss it, right? I mean, in your book on the history of jihad, you discuss things like the Crusades, right?
Oh yeah, there's a big chapter in the book on the Crusades, and a discussion in there on how they were justified and what the context of them is, of course, which was after 450 years of jihad activity that had overwhelmed half of the Christian world, that had never been answered by any military action at all by the Christians.
So Mohammed Hijab here is claiming that Islam was only responding with violence because, Christianity was the big enemy out there, whereas it was Christianity responding in the Crusades because of Islamic violence. Is that what you're claiming?
Well, yeah, actually, it started with the Battle of Manzikert in what is now eastern Turkey in 1071. And the Byzantine Empire suffered a catastrophic defeat, and the emperor Romanos was captured, and the empire actually lost its heartland, which was what is now Turkey. It was the agricultural center of the Byzantine Empire, and thus the source of its sustenance, really. And it lay open now for conquest by the Turks, which conquest was, of course, so thorough that now the land there is known as Turkey. Now, the emperor, the Byzantine emperor, seeing this happen, Alexius Comnenus, he was deeply alarmed, and even though this was only 17 years after the final split between the Eastern and Western churches, or what are known today as the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, he nonetheless appealed to the Pope for help and asked that the West send soldiers to keep the Christian empire from falling and to protect the Christians of the area. And it took some time for a variety of reasons, but it was in response to that call that the First Crusade was called by Pope Urban II in 1095.
Now, with that said, you grant that there were horrible atrocities committed during the Crusades, by the Christian side, right?
Oh yeah, and they're in the book as well.
So you don't try to conceal this fact. You can openly discuss things that happened in the name of Christianity or in the name of Christ, or not very often not in the name of anything, but since they're done by Christians, they get brought up as criticisms against Christianity. So you address this in your book, and you can go into any Christian bookstore and find discussions of these kinds of issues, violence in the history of Christianity. You can find condemnations of that. It's not a secret in Christianity. If you are an educated person, you go to college, you'll hear about these things, very often skewed versions of this to make things sound historically much worse than they actually were in certain circumstances. Yeah. But people don't hide from this, right? We don't hide from violence in the name of Christ wherever it has been committed.
No, never. I've never seen any Christians of any denomination say that the Crusaders did everything right, or that the Spanish missionaries, when they were going into South America, were never harsh with the natives. These things are openly acknowledged, and then there's various discussions of whether this was justifiable behavior, or to what extent it was, or how it could possibly have been in the context of these other things that were bad about it. Christians have never made any secret of the fact that, after all, you have here a theology that everyone is sinful, and so Christians have never shied away from acknowledging that fact in various ways in relation to specific incidents.
Mm-hmm. Now, So we will grant that there were lots of bad things done in the history of Christianity, but those things don't even seem to have gotten off the ground in any way until you get to the 4th century when the Roman Empire begins adopting Christianity. Are you aware of Christians turning to violence to spread Christianity for the first 3 centuries of Christianity? Christianity spreading across the Roman Empire, across other parts of the world. Even in the 1st century, it had spread to various parts of Africa, all the way down to Ethiopia, the Middle East. Christianity is all over the place. Are you aware of, you're a historian, are you aware of Christianity spreading through violence during these first 3 centuries?
There's not a single instance of that, David, anywhere. And that's a full 100% certainty on that. It simply would have been unheard of. And not only did it spread to the places you mentioned, but the Christians of India will tell you that Thomas the Apostle went there and preached the gospel in India in the 50s of the 1st century and founded the first churches there that trace their lineage back to him. And so you've got also, it's forgotten, I think, by Christians today, but also Christianity spread into Persia, even into Afghanistan. And this is all in the context of a time when there was discussion among the Christians of the Roman Empire whether it was even permissible for them to serve as soldiers in the Roman Empire, because that would involve killing. And there were many, many Christians who believed in the early centuries that that was something that they were absolutely forbidden to do under any circumstances. And so the idea that they would be worried about serving in the Roman imperial army and yet going around killing people for not converting, it's ludicrous. So there's just no record of that whatsoever.
Yeah, we actually had our earliest criticism from non-Christian sources. Our earliest criticism that we have on record of the early Christians was that they wouldn't participate in the gladiatorial games, meaning they didn't want to watch them, right? So they weren't supporting the state-sponsored gladiatorial games because they didn't want to watch people die. And they didn't want to treat this as sport. These were people who were created in the image of God. They didn't want to see them killed. So the only way Christians were going to participate was as the victims of these sorts of contests. So we look at Jesus as, we have Jesus and we have Mohammed. So we have the sort of central figure, the central pattern of conduct that we have in Christianity and Islam. And that would be the first place we should look if we're trying to compare these two ideologies in terms of peace and violence. Did Jesus go around spreading his message through the sword? Did he go around spreading the gospel through violence?
No, never, of course. And when Peter said, "Here are 2 swords," he said, "Put them away, that's enough." And when Islamic apologists like to invoke Luke 19:27, "Bring my enemies here and slay them before me," as if this is some command of Jesus presented in a straightforward manner. In reality, of course, this is a parable, and the statement is made in the context of the divine judgment and doesn't have anything to do with worldly punishment, and has never been interpreted by Christians of any sect or any denomination at any time in history as meaning that you should go and kill people who are the enemies of Christ. Even when Christians were being violent, they never invoked that verse in order to justify what they were doing. And of course, by contrast, you have Muhammad with the Quran saying, "Kill them wherever you find them" 3 times, and participating in battles, ordering the assassination of his enemies. It's night and day.
So you mentioned that Jesus told Peter to put his sword away. By the way, that was, for anyone who hasn't read the sources, don't know what we're talking about, this was in the context of the soldiers coming to take Jesus and put him on trial and execute him. So if there was ever a time in all of history where you should defend Jesus through violence, it would have been when soldiers are coming to take him away and kill him. There has never been a better time if you were going to respond with violence than that time, right? If you're not going to defend him then you're just not supposed to defend him with the sword. And again, Jesus condemned Peter for trying to react with violence. And so we have Jesus. Jesus doesn't spread his message through violence. Then we have the apostles themselves. And what's interesting is These were guys who would have started off pretty comfortable with violence before they encountered Jesus, before they spent several years learning from Jesus. When they were joining up with Jesus, when they were signing on as his disciples, their view of the Messiah was that the Messiah was going to go to war against the Romans, crush the Romans, and take rule over the entire world. So when these guys signed on, they were perfectly happy with conquering the world. Later, after spending several years with Jesus, when these guys get to go out, they condemn violence, right? They promote a message of love towards everyone. They command their followers to live in peace with everyone, to pray for all people, to honor all people. This is the impact that Jesus had on people who at the beginning would have been quite comfortable with violence. So on the one hand, you've got what Jesus taught. Jesus taught things like love your enemies, pray for those. Love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, things like that. Don't defend him with violence. And then you've got what Jesus did. What is Jesus' central message? That he's laying his life down for you, and that you should live like that for others. Then we turn to the apostles. They become more peaceful through the teachings of Jesus. We look at their teachings. They taught to love people, to honor people. They don't spread their message with violence. They condemn violence, and most of them eventually get killed and don't respond through violence. And then for the next few centuries of Christianity, for the first 3 centuries of Christianity, it doesn't cross the minds of Christians to spread their message through violence. Now, why is this important? Well, if you only start getting violence in Christianity once other groups start adopting Christianity, and those other groups already have their own way of doing things, right? Once the Roman Empire starts adopting Christianity, the Roman Empire already had a kind of a Roman Empire way of doing things, right? If it doesn't occur to anyone for 3 centuries to spread Christianity through violence, what can we say? We can say it doesn't arise from within Christianity itself. It has to come from somewhere outside. It has to come from someone else who already has a way of doing things. Now, once it's kind of attached to other people who have their own way of doing things, then you can get all sorts of things that you have in Christianity, things that we would point to and condemn, but it doesn't arise from within Christianity itself. So you've got Jesus, his followers, the first 3 centuries of Christianity. Mohammed Hijab said Christianity only spread through the sword. Well, it spread all over the place for 3 centuries without Christians using the sword. Now, Robert, if we're comparing Christianity and Islam, Jesus and Muhammad, if we're comparing those 2 positions and ideologies and founders, can we say that Islam is parallel to Christianity, and that for the first 3 centuries we don't see violence in Islam, and it's not until Islam is adopted by some violent regime that we start getting violence in there? Can we say that sort of thing? Let's go back to the founder himself. Did Muhammad peacefully spread his message and lay down his life for others?
Just the opposite. He said, who will take care of this poet, Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf, for me, because he has made fun of Allah and his apostle. He had his followers kill this man, and he rewarded them for it. Others also who criticized him, he had them murdered. He led battles himself, and they were offensive battles. They were not defensive battles. Unifying Arabia by the point of the sword and forcing Islam upon them. Of course, he taught in the Quran to fight and to kill and to subjugate the unbelievers. When you meet the unbelievers, strike the necks, and so on. There's nothing comparable to this in the New Testament, and consequently, we can see that when people who were serious about both tried to live them out, then the Christians were radically peaceful, and the Muslims were radically violent.
So Muhammad and his followers went out and did violently subjugate a variety of peoples, and the commands were things like Muhammad saying, I've been commanded to fight people until they say there's no God but Allah, and that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah, and they establish prayer and pay zakat, and if they do it, then their blood will be safe, right?
That's very important. And also the other hadith where he says, when you meet the unbelievers, first invite them to accept Islam. Now, in that, so far, it's just like Christianity. And then the second part, however, he says, but if they refuse, then invite them to pay the jizya, that is, accept subjugation under the rule of the Muslims. And if they refuse that, then seek Allah's help and fight them. And so it's as if the missionaries knock on your door and give you their brochure, and if you don't accept it, then they beat you up or kill you.
So this isn't some later Muslim king coming along centuries after the events. This is the founder and pattern of conduct himself. Muhammad is the pattern of conduct for Muslims. That's chapter 33, verse 21, ladies and gentlemen. So Muhammad is the pattern, and whether we look at his teachings or his example, we see Islam being spread through violence. That's correct, right?
That's it.
All right. Go ahead.
Yes. No, you go ahead. I was actually going to jump off to after Muhammad, but I think that may be where you were going.
Oh, yeah. Well, we have to, right? Because we looked at Christianity. We want to be consistent here. Our good friend Mohammed Hijab, who's given us no shortage of video material for many months to come. Mohammed Hijab insists that Islam spread organically, and
love that.
Yeah, my vocab the other day was talking about this, and he said it did spread organically. There were organs all over the place, right? On the battlefield. Now that's vocab's sick sense of humor, but yeah. So we look to that first example, that first pattern of conduct. Now the question that arises is how his initial followers understood his teachings and example. The reason this is important is, if we look at, let's say, Christianity, who was in a better position to understand the teachings and example of Jesus than his initial followers? So if these guys had gone out and gone on a killing spree, we would have some reason to think that maybe we're misinterpreting Jesus' message here. But we turn to Islam, and you and I are saying that Muhammad went out and began violently subjugating the population of Arabia, Jews, Christians, pagans, and so on. But maybe we're misinterpreting that, and maybe we're misinterpreting his commands to fight those who do not believe in Allah. I don't know how you can have a more clear statement than that. Fight those who do not believe in Allah, clear as day. But maybe we're misinterpreting this. Who would be better? Who would be better? Where can we go than to go to his initial followers and see how they interpreted his teachings and example? Do we find the 4 rightly guided caliphs and the armies that they commanded interpreting Muhammad's commands and example in a peaceful fashion so that they went out and spread Islam organically rather than through force?
Force all the way. We do not see them doing anything else, really. Right from the beginning, when Muhammad died in 632, his very fanatical, fervent follower Abu Bakr became the first caliph. And immediately a great number of, actually the most of the Arab tribes apostatized and said, oh, Muhammad's dead, then we're leaving Islam. And Abu Bakr sent his great general Khalid ibn al-Walid to fight them and reunite Arabia yet again, forcing these tribes yet again to accept Islam. These are the famous wars of apostasy, the Ridda wars, that made sure that Islam would survive. And it was all by force, organically, as vocab said, with organs all over the Arabian sands. Then you have Umar taking the fight to the infidels, conquering the Holy Land, conquering Jerusalem, conquering Egypt, conquering Syria, and in every case, this was a military conquest followed by the subjugation of the local population and their reduction to dhimmi status, denying them basic rights under the laws delineated in Islamic law and patterned after the command or based on the command of chapter 9 verse 29 of the Quran, which says that the people of the book must be made to pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. And so the effects of this, of course, we still see in the world. You look, for example, at Egypt. Egypt was 99% Christian before Umar came in, and now it's about 10% Christian. Did all the Christians leave Egypt? No. Life was just so hard for them under the subjugation that they were made to endure that over time, most of them converted to Islam. But this conversion was not because Islam was sweet reason and made sense and appealed to them on the basis of its intellectual prowess or its charity or anything or its wisdom. It was only because if they converted to Islam, they didn't have to pay this tax. They didn't have to be discriminated against. They didn't have to put up with harassment and sometimes outright violence. And so they converted. This is the organically spread Islam that Mohammed Hijab talks about, that nowhere did it go without violence and without force, and nowhere did people convert in large numbers except because of the onerous burdens that the non-Muslims faced. And of course, this is true all the way. Uthman continued to spread Islam by 732, and Ali was mainly preoccupied with civil wars. But then you have the Umayyad Caliphate after that up until 750. By 732, 100 years after Muhammad died, you have an empire stretching from Spain all the way across North Africa and the Middle East, Persia, and into India. And everywhere, it's harsh, it's brutal, it's living out the Quranic command. Muhammad is the apostle of Allah. Those who follow him are merciful to one another and ruthless to the unbelievers, which is chapter 48, verse 29.
Now, hold on. You're saying that Islam didn't spread to all these areas through defense?
Yeah, that's another one they always say. The Battle of Tabuk, which is really no battle at all, but Muhammad going up in 630 to fight the Byzantines. The Byzantines weren't even there, and they weren't there because they hadn't heard of Muhammad, and they didn't have enough troops to man all their forts, so they had their garrisons moving from one place to the other, and they were not in the least interested in bothering the Muslims, who they didn't even know existed at this time. And once you have the Muslims coming out of Arabia, you have no indication that anybody in North Africa or Egypt or Syria or Palestine was bothering them, and certainly not anybody from Persia. All of these were offensive wars, from Spain to India.
And just to review here, when the armies of jihad went out, and we're not talking about 5 centuries later, 10 centuries later, we're not talking about modern times, we're not talking about ISIS, we're just going to that first century of the Islamic armies marching out. The message that they brought to the unbelievers that they were attacking was, you need to, depending on who you were, convert, or you need to convert, or you will be fought, unless you happen to be a possibly protected group like Jews or Christians, in which case you could submit to the authority of Islam and pay the jizya. So that was the message. It wasn't, hey, we're just fighting you defensively. This has nothing to do with religion. We just want you to understand that you can't persecute Muslims.
There weren't any Muslims around for them to persecute. You know, I mean, the whole thing is so absurd on its face. It shows how people like Mohammed Hijab and other Islamic apologists rely on the ignorance of their audiences to carry across their message. And of course, most people today are ignorant of history. And this is all the more reason why it's important to try to get the word out. There were no Muslims in North Africa before the Muslims invaded. There were no Muslims in Egypt or Syria. They came as invaders. So there was nobody there who was being oppressed that they were trying to come to the defense of. And then in India, because you said they have the status of the people of the book and they can be subjugated. Of course, in India, the jihad was even more bloody because they did not have the people of the book status. And Hijab ibn Yusuf, the governor of Iraq, who sent in the early 8th century the first Muslim armies into India, he actually rebuked his top general there for being too merciful, too lenient toward the Hindus. He said, you have to make them just convert or die.
And so that's Islam sort of expanding east. Let's round out basically the first 3 centuries, because if we're talking about the first 3 centuries of Christianity, we should compare this with the first 3 centuries of Islam. And there's actually a good basis for that. Muhammad said that the best generation of Muslims was that first generation. and that the next best generation of Muslims would be the next generation, and that the next best generation of Muslims would be the third generation. So the farther back you get, the more authentic the believers are, and the implication would be that, modern Muslims just don't count for much at all, according to Muhammad. So if we look at those first three generations and we expand it on out, we've got the first 3 centuries of Islam. Muslims go east, somehow defensively, all the way fighting through just through defense, all the way into India. Be good to expand upon that a little bit more. But what happened as Islam spread west?
The same thing, really. You have the first siege of Constantinople, which was at that time the most important city in the Christian world, the seat of the Christian Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and Rome was in the middle of the Dark Ages and was in eclipse at the time. Constantinople was the real prize, and the Muslims besieged it in 675 first, again in 717, and they kept trying to get it for 1400 years until finally they did conquer it in 1453, which was a very great significant event for the Muslims because there was a prophecy of Mohammed in which he said, first you will conquer the new Rome, which is Constantinople, and then you will conquer the old Rome, which is the city we think of as Rome, which of course they're working on getting today. But here again you have aggressive warfare, not provoked by any attack. As I said, the Byzantines weren't even there when Muhammad went up to Tabuk in 630, and they were not prepared for this massive military strike from Arabia that rolled up a great deal of their empire in North Africa, in Egypt, and so on. And it's another historical myth that the Byzantine, that the people under Byzantine rule in Egypt and elsewhere, they welcomed the invaders. I've seen this written many times, and Islamic apologists like to say it, because supposedly the tax burden that the Byzantines were laying upon these people was so great that they hated them and were glad to be rid of them. Now, in contrast, when I wrote the book, The History of Jihad, I used primary sources, not what modern-day historians say, but what was going on at the time. And one noteworthy little bit of information from the conquest of Egypt has the Caliph Umar writing about it and saying that he needs money and saying that how do you think we're going to pay for the troops that we have to keep covering Egypt with? And I was thinking when I read that for the first time, why is it that he has to put any troops in Egypt at all? I thought that the Muslims were welcomed as liberators. But if he's got to cover the land with troops, as he said, then clearly the people are not very happy about their new overlords. And so he has to make sure that they stay in line. And here again, then, it's not a peaceful matter at all. And of course, the Muslims drove on across North Africa, which were ancient Christian lands where some of the most prominent Christians of the early church lived, Cyprian, Augustine of Hippo, and so on. And they went into Spain, they invaded Spain, and pressed on into France.
No, hang on. How could they possibly get into Spain, right? I mean, you'd have to cross some water there, and it's very odd to think that this was defensively. I mean, if you are going to a different continent, I don't know how you're doing that defensively. So how did that come about?
Well, actually, you're absolutely right. It was a gratuitous attack by the Muslims that was facilitated by a Christian who was angry with the Visigothic king of Spain. And so he lent the Muslims his boats so that they could deceive the Spanish guarding the shoreline and keep them from putting up their defenses. And it worked. But as far as the Muslims were concerned, the Visigoths had not attacked them in North Africa, had not bothered them at all, and they had no reason to invade Spain other than that they had this imperative from Muhammad that you quoted earlier. I've been commanded to fight against people until they confess that there is no God but Allah and I'm his messenger.
So the Muslim armies crossed over into Europe and were attacking Europe. And this is before the Crusades, right? So this wasn't a retaliation against Islamic violence, right?
This is the year 711 when the Muslims first entered Spain, and that's
Whoa, 711. You sure about that?
oh yeah,
So you're saying this is still within the first century?
yes.
Wow.
And so you've got those great generations doing this, and that's 384 years before the First Crusade was called.
So Christians were putting up with violent attacks in Europe for centuries before they went out and retaliated against the Middle East.
Yes, that's right. And the retaliation against the Middle East was just that, as we said. It was a defensive and a really small scale defensive reaction to all this conquest that had Islamized half of what had been the Christian world before the advent of Islam.
So why if the Muslims invaded Europe, did they stop because they eventually realized that Muhammad called for peace with unbelievers? And so they realized, hey, some of our leaders, some of our generals, some of our caliphs have been misinterpreting the commands of Allah and Muhammad, and we need to get back to the basics of Islam, namely living in peace with the unbelievers, and therefore we need to halt our aggression against the unbelievers, against the Christians. Is that what happened?
No, unfortunately not. Nor was there a moderate Muslim movement that stood up and said, you're misunderstanding Islam and you have to halt these armies. There was never any, this was done by the leaders of the Islamic world, and there was never any pushback among Muslims.
So why did they stop then?
They got stopped in 732 in the middle of France. It's really, I think a lot of people think that they were down in southern France right by Spain. But if you look at the map of France, Poitiers and Tours, where the great battle was fought in 732 that stopped them, it's in north central France. And they were advancing briskly. They were stopped by Christian armies that were defending France and the rest of the continent, for that matter. The historian Edward Gibbon says that there was nothing that would have kept the whole of Europe from being conquered and Islamized, except for this French army at Tours. There was nothing in Germany, nothing in Poland that would have stopped them. And they would have, if they had not been stopped there, they would have gone all the way across Europe.
Well, now I am hopelessly confused because according to Mohammed Hijab, Islam was just spreading organically and only resorted to fighting when it was a force that was threatening Muslims. And here you're talking about Islam crossing over into Europe and trying to take over Europe and only stopping when they were forced to from an outside force. And I'm trying to compare this with Christianity, where Christianity spreads through peaceful preaching and conversion, and you only get any hints of violence once an outside force starts adopting it. So it seems to be a complete reversal of what we find in Islam, and all of this is a complete reversal from the claims of a self-styled academic researcher like Mohammed Hijab.
Yeah, I think Mohammed Hijab's claims were entirely cynical. I expect he himself knows that they're not true, but he was figuring that his audience doesn't know that they're not true. And you, of course, did not have an opportunity to respond. And so he knew he could get away with it. If he does not know these things, then he himself has been indoctrinated with a lot of the revisionist and worthless historical fiction that is passing for reality in all too many universities today, and I would think that would be unfortunate. But it may be that he is a victim, but I rather think that he is a perpetrator.
Yeah, normally when a Muslim tells me Islam is peaceful and that, it was Christianity that was violent and the Crusades and Muslims were just minding their own business for centuries when Christians decided to attack them in order to convert them to Christianity. I normally don't think someone's trying to trick me or deceive me. I normally think, okay, this person absorbed a lot of nonsense from all kinds of sources. If the person thinks that, so I normally think, okay, this person hasn't read the Muslim sources. This person hasn't studied history. This person has heard this from his or her parents or imam or the media or something like that. But I normally don't think deception. However, if someone has studied the Muslim sources, which Mohammed Hijab has, and he's an academic researcher, meaning he's done a lot of academic research, then he would have to know. So when you're claiming that Islam only spread organically and that Christianity only spread through violence, there are only two possibilities. One, you're completely ignorant. You have no clue what you're talking about. You've never studied anything remotely resembling a historical source. Or you have studied these things and you're trying to deceive people. And so those are the two possibilities here. And again, I would normally give a person the benefit of the doubt, conclude that he or she isn't trying to deceive me. The person just hasn't done any studying. But Mohammed Hijab doesn't want us to believe that he doesn't know what he's talking about. And so that would seem like the only conclusion to draw. So according to Robert Spencer here, and he's going with primary sources in his book, this is where he's getting this information. So he's not getting this from some modern writer like Karen Armstrong or John Esposito. He's going to primary sources. Muslims fought their way westward across northern Africa, up into Europe, and Christians didn't launch the counterattack into Muslim lands for centuries. And that's what happened there. Now, you talked about the initial incursions into India, but we know that they didn't stop. First, going back to what you said about Constantinople. So this was a goal laid down from the time of Muhammad, right? According to Muslim sources.
Yes. So at least dating from the 9th century when the Hadith was probably written, but we've had that debate already.
Yeah. But Muslims are convinced that this was a teaching of Muhammad, right? You have to go for Constantinople. And according to primary sources, Muslims kept going after Constantinople over and over again.
800 years, really.
Relentlessly.
They conquered it.
Relentlessly until they actually conquered it.
And when they conquered it, they were extraordinarily brutal. And a lot of the citizens of Constantinople had gone into the Hagia Sophia Cathedral to pray, and they thought that, I think probably they were also hoping that the Muslims would be merciful to the people who were in there by the ancient right of sanctuary in places of worship. But what happened instead was that the Muslims rode their horses into the cathedral, hacking people to death right there in the church itself, raping women, and tearing down the place, grabbing all the gold and plundering and so on. And then the caliph himself, the Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror, went into the church with an imam who he ordered to mount the pulpit and say there's no God but Allah and Muhammad is his messenger. And then the place was a mosque, which of course it was up until it was made into a museum by the secular Turks in the 1930s. But now it looks like Erdogan and the Turkish government want to make it a mosque again. But you think about that in light of the organic spread of Islam, according to Mohammed Hijab. There's nothing organic about the how Hagia Sophia became a mosque. Hagia Sophia became a mosque by a brutal and bloody conquest and massacre of the Christians who were in it at the time that the Muslims entered the city.
Now, these are of course Christians. These are of course Christians. And so maybe the Christians were doing some really bad stuff and we just aren't aware of it, and maybe we're misinterpreting all of this. You mentioned the spread into Persia and all the way out to India. You mentioned that that there was a condemnation of the Muslim ruler for not being harsh enough with the Hindus and of attempting to grant them dhimmi status. So carry us a little bit further in the eastward expansion of Islam.
Well, ultimately, it was just not practical to kill all the Hindus who would not convert to Islam. And so they were granted dhimmi status, but it was never really on the same level as in the areas that were Christian, Egypt and Syria and so on. For example, the Quran speaks, as you know, about protecting churches and synagogues where the name of Allah is spoken, but it doesn't say anything about the Hindu temples or Buddhist or anything. And so the Indian conquerors would routinely tear down the Hindu temples and destroy the Hindu idols. They would break them into pieces, and on many, many occasions put the pieces out in front of the mosques so that the Muslims would be walking over, trampling upon the Hindu gods as they went in and out of the mosque every day. And they were just as brutal to the Hindus themselves. While they were sometimes given the right to pay the jizya or given the opportunity to pay the jizya and submit, at other times, especially with people like Hindu priests, a lot of stories. And here again, these are from Muslim court historians who were writing about how great the king, the emperor was, who was doing all these things at the time they happened.
So just to be clear, this isn't from Hindus who were biased against the Muslims because they hated the Muslims so much, and so they're making things up about the Muslims. This is from Muslims.
Yes, and I read these Muslim sources, and they're kind of appalling and I only used Muslim sources in the book for the conquest of India, and they're happy about this. Well, like Ibn Ishaq in his biography of Muhammad, and he makes Muhammad out to be a cutthroat sort of mafia type, warlord, assassin, and so on. But he's thrilled. He loves him. And it's the same thing in these Muslim court historians in India. They chronicle all this brutality and bloodshed and bloodlust and slavery and so on, and they love it. And they're happy about it. Anyway, they would make the Hindu priests do things like they would slaughter cows, of course, which are sacred to the Hindus, and then put the cow's flesh in bags that they would force the Hindu priests to wear right under their noses. Kind of humiliation and degradation. As we know, David, intimidation and degradation are favorite weapons of Islamic spokesmen to this day. And I think that it's always been a kind of sadism that runs through Islam all the way back to Muhammad, and was evidenced in your debate where Mohammed Hijab spent much of his time, I think, to cover up the fact that he didn't have any real arguments. So he spent most of his time insulting you instead, trying to get you off balance and nervous and defensive. And you did that, came through that magnificently. I was very happy to see it. But the same kind of intimidation and degradation is something that is a hallmark of Islamic history, and especially in India, where the people, not being people of the book, were made to suffer things that, in many cases, Jews and Christians, as harshly as they were treated in the West, did not go through. And one very noteworthy thing to say about the jihad against India is the strange and wonderful story of Akbar the Great, one of the Mughal emperors. And this is along around the 16th century. Akbar the Great, he started out his career just as brutal and bloodthirsty as the other Mughal emperors had been, the Muslim emperors of India. And so he was destroying temples and killing Hindus all over the place. But for whatever reason, he began to be disenchanted with Islam. And he ultimately left Islam altogether. And he was starting his own religion. He liked to, I think he was a interesting guy. He liked to have the people say Allahu Akbar, not because he was a pious Muslim, just the opposite, because his name was Akbar. And so they were saying Akbar is God, Akbar is Allah. And as he became less and less Islamic, and he tried to, I don't think they ever met, but he reached out to the Christian missionaries, the Portuguese in Goa, and he was speaking with Hindu priests and others, and he began to relax the restrictions on the Hindus. And his son, Jahangir, was a Muslim hardliner, and he was very upset with his father about this. And so he asked his father why he was doing it. And his father said, look, we're all created by the same God, and these are human beings as much as I am. And who am I to say that they don't have a right to live and worship as they please? Really, it's a remarkable statement coming from somebody in the context of Islam. But what's noteworthy about it is much more about Akbar the Great. It's a great story. You can read about him in the history of jihad. But the thing about it is that it's a noteworthy thing that the only time a Muslim ruler in the whole bloody history of the jihad against India was ever good to the Hindus was when he left Islam, which is just the opposite of what you'd expect from Mohammed Hijab. That you'd think that all the organic spread of Islam would mean that the Muslim rulers were just wonderful to the Hindus, and the Hindus would be so moved by their compassion and magnanimity that they would convert to Islam in droves. It was just the opposite. The Muslims were horrible to the Hindus, and the only time that one of them wasn't was when he was less Islamic.
Well, now I'm hopelessly confused. I don't know what to believe, right? Because it sounds like you're telling me that Muhammad and his followers for the first several centuries, they went out and conquered the Jews of Arabia, conquered the Christians there, then kept on fighting all the way to Constantinople, all the way across northern Africa, all the way up into Europe in the west, and then went after the Persians. I mean, simultaneously they're going after the Persians, fighting all the way out to India, fighting the Hindus. So you've got groups all across the Muslim world. You have different groups, different leaders following different commands of different generals and so on. And they're all coming to the same conclusion about what they're supposed to do, right? And so now if this is what Muhammad said and did, and this is what his companions and the rightly guided caliphs said and did, and this is what the first 3 centuries of Muslims said and did, there are only two possible explanations. One, either Islam does call for the violent subjugation of the entire world, and Muslims set out to do this, and the only time they didn't succeed is when they were stopped. Or two, Allah and Muhammad are the worst communicators in all of history. Right? They're trying to say, hey guys, just spread organically. Just spread your message through peaceful preaching. But it comes out, fight those who do not believe in Allah. I've been commanded to fight people until they say there's no God but Allah. It just keeps coming out like Muhammad has some sort of Tourette's syndrome and Allah has some sort of cosmic Tourette's syndrome. They want to say peaceful things, but they just can't manage to. It keeps coming out as all of these violent orders to subjugate the entire world. And by the way, you peaceful Muslims out there, if you ever wonder why groups like ISIS would gladly kill you too, why you are in danger from groups like ISIS, it's because of that, right? When you say, oh no, he said fight those who do not believe in Allah, but what he really meant is only fight in self-defense, only spread organically. You're basically saying that you are a better, clearer communicator than Allah himself. In his eternal word, which he had all eternity to get it exactly the way he wanted, and you're saying that you, in the United States of America, have come along and said it far better than he ever could.
And also, if Islam taught peace, if Muhammad taught peace, and the Quran teaches peace, then you've also got the fact that the foremost exponents of this message, the rightly guided caliphs, followed by the Umayyad Caliphate, the Abbasid Caliphate, the Umayyad Caliphate of Cordoba, the Fatimid Shiite Caliphate, the Ottoman Empire, the Persians, when they became Shiite, and every last Islamic entity that has ever been in the world has misunderstood Islam and thought that it had to do with warfare against unbelievers, because every one of those entities that I just named and many others have pursued that warfare. And none of them have ever said we have to live in peace with the unbelievers.
So yeah, those are your options, my Muslim friends. Either 14 centuries of jihadis were correct. They understood exactly what Muhammad and Allah were commanding. Or you, the peaceful westernized Muslim, you're the one who finally came along after 14 centuries of Muslims. You're the one who finally figured out what Allah really meant. And if that's what you're claiming, then what you're claiming is Allah is just a horrible communicator. His prophet is just a horrible communicator, because no one understood what they were saying for 14 centuries. You come along. So that's, again, that's why groups like ISIS would have nothing but contempt for you. You are showing contempt for your God and your prophet when you think that off the top of your head, when you've never studied a Muslim source in your life, you can understand what Allah and Muhammad said and meant far better than 14 centuries of Muslims and Muslim scholars and Muslim leaders who were swimming in a sea of Islamic teachings and commands. All right, we've only got a couple of minutes left. I did want to answer one quick question on the Super Chat because it's relevant to what we're talking about. Rocky Flintstone says, I've been a fan of you, Mr. David, and Mr. Robert. Will you be open to translating your videos into Urdu and Hindi to reach Pakistani and Indian people? I can speak for myself. Yes, absolutely. As far as videos I've made, this shows you what a horrible, horrible person I am, but it actually shows you how little time I have with 5 kids and 2 of them disabled and so on. I actually have Urdu-speaking Pakistanis and Indians who've been asking me for content, saying they'd love to translate it and dub certain videos or re-record certain videos in their own language. And I just am always way behind on things like that. But you have my permission. If you want to take my videos, download them, add subtitles, re-upload them to your own channel, you can do that anytime. You don't have to give me credit. I don't care. If you want to take something I said in a video, take the content, re-record it in your own language, you saying it, you don't have to give me credit. I don't care. I'm not stingy with my material. And just so you know, when I get a chance, when I get more squared away time-wise, I will be glad to send out content to people who want to do some translating. I did, with these last couple minutes, want to give a quick shout out to everyone who contributed on the Super Chat. Ham Sunshine, Tom S., Chaco Curran, Gerald Perry, Arlen 3, and Pedro Rodriguez, and of course Rocky Flintstone. Hope I didn't miss anyone. But thank you to everyone. Now, Robert.
Yes, sir.
The thing that bothered me most about that debate was not Mohammed Hijab insulting me. I've repeatedly told people I don't have any problem with people insulting me. I know that I upset Muslims, and so even death threats don't bother me anymore. I've gotten too many of them, so I understand that. I understand a Muslim being upset at me, given the things that I say, the information that I share about Islam. So that doesn't bother me at all. I was bothered a bit. By Mohammed Hijab agreeing beforehand that we weren't going to go off topic, there wouldn't be insults or personal attacks, that we would be respectful and friendly and so on. I did have a problem with him agreeing to that ahead of time and then completely violating it as if he had never, ever intended to honor that agreement. And you and I have had that experience before, right?
Yeah, we had that debate with the Shiites in, was it Philadelphia?
Yeah, somewhere around there.
Yeah, and the guy was all friendship and sweetness and light, and then at the end, when it was impossible for me to respond, he began a series of ad hominem attacks, making various claims that I was responsible for mass murder and so on. And,
talking about politics when we were required to agree ahead of time that there weren't going to be personal attacks, there weren't going to be discussions of politics and so on, right?
That's right. But you know how this all gets justified. Muhammad said, war is deceit.
War is deceit. And by the way, guys, that's happened to me over and over and over again in my interactions with Muslims. Now, to be fair, I've had Muslims who honored who honored the rules of the debate, didn't have any problem with, honored their time limits and so on. But over and over again, when I've been required to agree to terms ahead of the debate, I've seen every time that I can think of right now, the rules were violated. And so, but even that is not what really, really bothered me. What bothered me most was that the audience would mindlessly cheer for anything, even if it was obviously false, right? So there are all kinds of things that we could point out here. Mohammed Hijab said all kinds of things that are false. We'll be addressing those in videos. Lots of videos have already been made by myself and other people. But on something like this issue, where Mohammed Hijab yells, Christianity only spread through violence, and Islam just grew organically, and the crowd cheers. Robert, it almost seems to me like the Muslim crowd, and just to be clear, this is not all Muslims, but the crowd that would follow Mohammed Hijab, it seems like they actually want to be lied to.
Yeah, sure. Well, look, you have a closed culture. You have this idea of don't ask questions, because many people have lost their faith by asking questions. It's chapter 5, verse 101 of the Quran. And so free inquiry is discouraged. Doubts are stigmatized, such that even the investigation to try to determine if the thing is true is dangerous. And you have a group of people who live in this atmosphere. They're hungry for somebody to come along and tell them that it's all right, it's all true. And even if they know that they have to stretch it to get there, it's a very great need that they have, because the alternative is just not thinkable for them. They can't leave the community. They'll be shunned by their family. They'll be under death threat. They could be killed, and so on.
So you've
Better
got
locked to by Mohammed Hijab than to be killed.
So you've got Mohammed Hijab, and the reason he is all too happy to lie to his audience is that the audience is all too happy to be lied to. If I were to make up things while debating, I wouldn't have to hear about it from Muslims or from atheists. I would hear about it from Christians. Christians would be messaging me saying, how dare you, David? How dare you say these things that are false? But if you are a Muslim debater and you make things up, there are just no repercussions for you. And that's just a sad state of affairs. All right. Well, it kind of breaks my heart to sign off now, because we have 900 people still on, but we're going to have many more live streams here in the coming weeks and months. And we don't want to go through all the material. Probably in our next live stream, I'm going to have Anthony Rogers on, and we're going to discuss Allah's physical characteristics. If you watch the debate, you'll remember that Mohammed Hijab seemingly had no clue what I was talking about when I said that Allah's body parts, the physical descriptions of his body parts, his face, his hands, his legs, and so on, were, according to Muslim scholars themselves, supposed to be interpreted literally. Mohammed Hijab says he had no clue what I was talking about. He's not aware of that. So Anthony Rogers and I are going to be happy to share some knowledge about Islam with him. Until then, thank you, Robert Spencer. We'll have Robert on again, because there will always, unfortunately, be issues to discuss with respect to jihad. So until we're here again, just remember, if you're going to walk on thin ice, you might as well dance.